In this section, we'll look at probably one of the biggest problems that FDR faced at the end of the first New Deal, the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court had 9 justices appointed by life, and many of the justices had been appointed by the conservative Republicans in the 1920s. They took a very narrow view of what the Constitution allowed. There were 4 conservatives on the Supreme Court who the liberals called the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. There were 3 liberals and then there were 2 swing votes. The Supreme Court added up, frequently would view FDR's New Deal legislation in a negative light. The average age of the justices, by the way, was 70 years old. In May 1935, the court ruled in the case of Schechter versus the United States that the National Industrial Recovery Act was unconstitutional. It therefore said the NRA no longer could exist. It was void. The case involved a New York company convicted of violating the NRA's poultry code, and it was often referred to as a result as the sick chicken case. In a unanimous ruling, the court held that the NIRA violated the Constitution in 2 ways. First, the Constitution gave Congress the right to regulate interstate commerce, and the court claimed that Congress could not delegate code writing authority to the executive branch, which is what it believed that had happened. It was a violation of separation of powers. Also, the Supreme Court said that many of the activities for which the codes were written were not interstate commerce. The interstate commerce was the only type of business that the federal government could regulate. For example, it held that the right to the manufacturing was not an area that the federal government could regulate. It was not interstate commerce, which was, of course, a very narrow view of the Constitution. As it turned out, the chicken company in question had gotten chickens from across state lines, but the court still said that all chicken processing in that case was in one state, so it was not interstate commerce. The NRA hadn't really been that successful, and when it was declared unconstitutional, FDR undoubtedly assumed that he would have to make another move in that direction. In January 1936, the Supreme Court moved again. In the case of United States versus Butler, the Supreme Court ruled that the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the AAA, was unconstitutional. The Supreme Court had, therefore, very quickly ruled 2 cornerstones of the first early New Deal, the program that FDR had created for the workers and the program he created for the farmers, were both null and void. The Supreme Court held that the Agricultural Adjustment Act's tax on the agricultural processors, it wasn't a revenue-raising mechanism as FDR claimed, but rather was an unconstitutional attempt to limit production. The court held that agriculture was a local matter, not an interstate matter that the federal government could regulate. FDR was ticked off by both decisions and decried what he called a backward-looking, quote, horse and buggy definition of interstate commerce. FDR asked how, in our advanced economy, the federal government could solve any economic crisis with such a narrow definition of interstate commerce. This concludes this section of the problems of the Supreme Court at the end of the first early New Deal.